This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon, click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. My guest today is a lecturer at the University of Haifa's Department of Israeli History and the director of the Ruderman Program for American Jewish Studies, as well as an ordained Reform rabbi. His book, Judah Magnes, The Prophetic Politics of a Religious Binationalist, was published in English by the Jewish Publication Society in 2021. Dr. David Barak Korodetsky, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, Gilad. Great to be here with you.
So Magnes is virtually the most complex personality in the history of early Zionism, an American, an academic, an ordained Reform rabbi, a Zionist, a prominent proponent of binationalism until his death, soon after the establishment of the State of Israel. Now, Anita Shapira, the eminent historian of Israel, once observed that the biographer's craft is often guided by a mystery. You know, he or she seeks to unpack the greatness of the person they are writing about. Otherwise, they wouldn't be writing about them. Now, it seems to me that in this book, you were also guided by a mystery, but of a slightly different kind. How was Magnes able to reconcile so many contradictions in his worldview?
So indeed, I think there was something that drew me to Magnes that had to do with a bit of an enigmatic nature to Magnes that some of the other biographers have also referred to. I met Avraham Shapira Apache, who was a renowned scholar in Israel, and he was the biographer of Gershom Shalom. So when I met him in his office, he went to pick up like his notes, and he had this small like handwritten note from Gershom Shalom that says, Magnes was the most complex person I've ever met in my life. So that was, of course, originally a draw. My original kind of question was this. We have such a prominent figure who's a binationalist. And all the biographers that explore his work, nobody seems to refer to the fact that he's a rabbi and he's a religious figure. And this is what essentially drew me to the question. I wasn't sure where I was going to find, but also if you look at his contemporaries, which are, let's say, Norman Bentwich, the DA of the British mandate at the time, or Hugo Bergman, they point to this specific aspect of his work, and that's what I decided to delve into and to essentially try to understand and unpack in a more kind of specific terms, what's the political theology of Judah Magnes? How does religion influence his political work, but also the personality behind that, the motivation, the kind of what brings him to this position.
Yeah, we're going to unpack that in detail in a minute, but maybe just to as some sort of a background, how did he become a Reform rabbi, and how did a Reform rabbi of his generation arrive in Palestine in the first place? I mean, at the time, and to an extent to this very day, these two elements are contradictory.
So Magnes was, first of all, the golden boy of the Reform movement. He was the first American-born, west of the Mississippi, kind of born in California, rabbi ordained in Hebrew Union College in the year 1900. He is an early Zionist in the Reform movement. There aren't that many, but that's a very prominent kind of position to hold. He clashes with the Hebrew Union College administration because he is a Zionist. He clashes with his early congregations, including Temple Emmanuel in New York around 1910, because he holds a Zionist position. He was one of the very few American Jewish leaders that did eventually make Aliyah. If you look at the history of that, not many people know, but Abba Hillel Silver was offered to be the mayor of Ramat Gan in 1947, and he refused. I think he was looking back at Magnes and Henrietta Sold, which are the two main prominent Jewish American leaders, and essentially seeing, first of all, not many of them had, like, let's say, the push motivation factors to immigrate to Israel, but they were not well received here. That goes to Magnes, goes to some extent to Henrietta Sold's story. So we have the story of a Reform rabbi ordained in a movement that is anti-Zionist at the time, or at least non-Zionist, if you look at the Pittsburgh Platform and that period of thinking. And what I kind of discovered about Magnes is that he is also, first of all, he's an early conservative. He tries to take his congregation, Temple Emmanuel, from the Reform to the conservative movement around 1910.
Conservative capital C.
Yeah, in terms of conservative movement. So, but he's also a bit of a much more traditionalist in terms of his thinking. So essentially what I think found out throughout the book, we have a Reform rabbi with a traditionalist kind of a religious soul and religious kind of thinking, and still a Reform political worldview, which I elaborate upon.
How was he drawn to Zionism in the first place?
I think he's drawn to Zionism. He writes as early as 1896. When he's 18, he writes a piece which is something like Zionism or Death. I'm trying to remember. He's very passionate at the time. He's drawn, I think, first of all, by the East, by the kind of German, when he does the PhD in Germany, he's drawn by the Ostjuden kind of traditionalist kind of views. He is, I think he's very influenced by Solomon Schechter, who was also married him and officiated his wedding and was already a Zionist. And he's very influenced by Echad Ha'am. He reads Echad Ha'am very early, influenced by the thought of Echad Ha'am, which kind of gives him more of a sense of Jewish peoplehood and a sense of the soul of the spirit, Ruach HaUmah, like the spirit of the nation, as Echad Ha'am uses the term, as early as the turn of the century. So that's where essentially he picks up his Zionism.
Mm-hmm. And now this is a deliberately provocative question.
Sure.
Was he a religious Zionist? Would you term him that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think I've been asked that before. I think from my point of view, it's fair to say that he is a religious Zionist. His Zionism is motivated, on the one hand, by a political understanding of the place where Jews are in the world at the time and the requirements, let's say a more kind of pragmatic approach to Zionism. But he is a deeply inspired religious soul, and he is a Zionist. I think he offers a reading of religious Zionism, which is a liberal religious Zionism reading. You can see echoes of that in thinkers of today as well. It doesn't catch on that much in Israel-Palestine at the time. But I think from the way I understand him, there's a deeply religious aspect to his Zionism, and that's essentially one of the motivating factors that pushes him.
Yeah, so trying to map out perhaps the situation of religion in Zion at the time. So maybe there's Echad Ha'am that you say that he inspired him greatly, and then there's Hamizrahi movement and Rabbi Kook, and maybe the third pole of that triangle is Magnes, and whoever he stood for and whatever he stood for. How would you characterize the relationship with the other two poles?
So just an earlier comment there, when Magnes is speaking with Solomon Schechter in New York around the early 20th century, especially Schechter, they're very concerned by Zionism's secularist nature. Schechter says, I'm not sure we'll be able to remain a Zionist if it's such a secular movement. So if you look at the early Reform and kind of conservative thinkers, they have a traditionalist kind of religious view, and they are critical of Zionism from that point of view. If you look at the religious strands of Zionism within, let's say, 20s and onwards, the post kind of Balfour Declaration Zionism, I think Magnes comes together with a group of other people that are also those that form Brit Shalom and the Hebrew University kind of circles at the time. So these are religious Zionist thinkers influenced by Buber, influenced by the kind of thought that emerges post World War I. They're critical they have a sense of a critique of nationalism, which is post World War I. They see let's say the tragedy of the First World War, and they harbor concerns about a certain form of nationalism, and they tie nationalism with a moral question, also in relation to the Arab question. So you have, within those strands of Zionism, you have classical Mamlachti, Ben Gurion kind of Zionism at the time, and then you have the religious Zionism of Rav Kook that's emerging also in his thinking after his piece, The War, in 1919, and you have these essentially moral question religious Zionists, which some of them come from a more European background. And the uniqueness of Magnes, which I also try to unpack, is the Reform and American underpinnings of his thinking on religion and on Zionism.
Yeah, this is another thing that I would like to explore in a minute. But you said earlier that his religious worldview was broadly liberal, which is really what made him stand apart from other more traditional, more orthodox strands in religious Zionism at the time. Can you elaborate on this a bit about the differences and how they came into play?
So I think Magnes is a protege, or essentially a follower of Reform's political thinking, which I'll maybe outline two main features there. One of them is ethical monotheism. It's a thought that's developed also by Herman Cohen, but it's also earlier than that. It's essentially the idea that what Jews bring to the world is ethics and monotheism, is an ethical form of monotheism, and that in that sense, that's where lies the unique contribution to the world. The second aspect of that is a mission to the world. That's called mission theology. So looking at Magnes's Reform underpinnings and liberal underpinnings, his thought essentially evolves around the idea that Jews have a mission to the world, and that mission has to do with ethics and ethics in politics. He adopts also a pacifist view throughout the First World War. So if you look at the liberal underpinnings to his thinking, it's mostly the idea of moral ethics as essential to Jewish identity, as essential to the kind of politics that needs to be realized in Palestine, and also within the broader circle of Brit Shalom, the idea that the Arab question is the litmus test to understanding or to justifying even the existence of the State of Israel. So for Magnes, it goes up in 1947. He essentially, when he becomes a bit more bleak and pessimistic about what's happening, he essentially says that it might have been better to not realize a state if the moral consequences are such and such. Of course, there is a room to really unpack what that morality is, how that plays vis-a-vis the other forms of morality at the time, and the other, let's say, juxtapositions of morality in politics.
As you say, his circle were mostly, well, non-American. There were hardly any Americans in Palestine at the time, and the Brit Shalom and intellectual Hebrew University sort of circles were all Central European, German-speaking Yekers in short. And there were, as you show, some American dimensions that he brought to the public life of the issue of the Jewish community in Palestine. What were these American dimensions?
I think, maybe the most important dimension was a form of pragmatism as political thinking, which is also demonstrated in, first of all, his faith that there is a solution. I think he doesn't hold like the kind of sometimes tragic nature that maybe other thinkers of European order kind of hold. Essentially, Americans are pragmatists that believe, first of all, from a practical perspective, that there are solutions for conflicts, but from a more...
Is that the source of his optimism all along? I mean, the fact that he didn't give up, unlike others along the way?
I think there's two sources. He has ups and downs in terms of optimism. One of my claims in the book is that he doesn't give up because because it's a sense of mission for him. He has this idea, essentially trying to enforce upon history a certain vision, even when he knows he fails, and even when he sees the failure unfolding. He says this back in 1928 when he reads Karl Barth, and writes in his diary. He knows to some extent that his mission is going to fail, but I also perceive his kind of prophetic religious personality as driving a continuity above and beyond the pessimism that I think he did also entail. But if you look at, going back to the question about the American nature of his work, he's trying to implement a solution which is also copied from the American kind of political thinking. He says this very directly. He said, I've been reading the Federalist Papers. He says, he offers a system that has essentially a two-house system. That's his binational system. It copies the idea of the Senate and the House. There's also, in terms of pragmatism, I think he misses upon the messianic nature, both of Zionism and the kind of, let's say, mythical, kind of deeper nature of the objection to Zionism on the other side. He holds this view that if you can convince both sides that this would be for the better good, then this might work. But this, I think, it's a question throughout the history of, I would say, American or Jewish American involvement with the conflict that does not seem to materialize.
Recently, a few weeks ago, we had as a guest here on the podcast the Jewish American historian Jeffrey Levin, who recently wrote this very good book about early anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian sentiments among American Jews. Also, then his book is really about the immediate aftermath of the establishment of the State of Israel. So Magnes, in a way, preceded them only slightly. But as you show and as you've said so far, he was foreign to them no less than he was foreign to Ben-Gurion and his circle, wasn't he?
I think to some extent he was also, and he still is today, a source of inspiration for many of the circles within American Judaism that are critical of Zionism throughout history. I think he shares certain, I think he's more religious in a traditional kind of, theological way, the way that I'm describing in the book, but I think he shares with them a certain model that has to do with a projection of moral, idealistic expectations of the state vis-a-vis, let's say, more realistic kind of realpolitik kind of politics that are also, prevailing at the state at the time. So I think there is. I'll say a few words about this. First of all, I think that I've come up with this term recently, and I think it has also describes this idea pretty well. Is the idea of moral exceptionalism. So moral exceptionalism is both a term that describes the American kind of setting. Americans in general tend to have a very moralistic view of their own country or of their own
Not
state.
just Jews, Americans.
Not just Jews. So this is kind of a general term. And I think that's an American aspect that comes into play when you analyze the way American Jews in general approach the question of Israel-Palestine. But I think there's also essentially a projection of the most idealistic views of Judaism demonstrated through the prophetic kind of politics. There's the messianic aspect of the prophetic politics is projected upon a very bleeding, realpolitik, messy conflict in Israel-Palestine. Part of my critique, I would say, of Magnes to that end and of various of his followers is that they tended to project that idea more in Palestine than they did back home. It's kind of, the imagined Israel we always wanted it to be as a political vision, not taking into account the kind of realistic aspects and sometimes trying to push like the messianic gun to that end.
Mm-hmm. And also, looking at it from the other side, it's this sort of almost a trite truism is that American Jews are from Venus and Israelis are from Mars.
Indeed.
So was really Magnes an early iteration of that? The fact that he was so foreign to public life in the issue was really evidence?
I think indeed. First of all, Magnes, he's very lonely when he's here in Palestine. That's also something that I think needs to be understood. There's very few expats. He has some connections with a few others like Jesse Samter. But if you look at the way he is accepted or received by the political establishment and the intellectual establishment in Palestine, there's a lack of understanding of his religious worldview and his religious underpinnings and cultural underpinnings. Shmaryahu Levin, a Zionist leader, says to him, what are you talking about? We know you didn't grow on the knees of Torah, right? So that also goes to the question of the applicability of a political theology which is liberal in a place like Israel at the time. First of all, it's a very secular kind of setting, and there's not necessarily an applicability for any form of political theology within those circles. But Magnes is an American outsider, a loner, removed from his settings. He reads the Christian Century in 1928, and he doesn't read Rosenzweig and he's not within that intellectual milieu. He's very much influenced. He complains about the lack of hot water in Jerusalem, and those kind of Americanisms that we would expect from Americans today as well. And he's a tragic, to some extent, figure and a prototype of let's say the failed expectations of American Jews in relation to Israel politics and beyond.
Yeah. So a little bit about the dual underpinnings of this work, the historical part on the one hand and the theological, perhaps religious one on the other. About you are a historian and an ordained rabbi. How did these two strands in you come into play when writing this book?
First of all, also, I'm reflecting, the book has been written quite a few years back as a PhD and later published in Hebrew and then in English. So I'm also reflecting back. I think you also, you quoted Anita Shapira, who's a very kind of notable biographer and probably the leading biographer in Israel. I think I was always trying to reflect on the extent to which I was self-reflective enough on what I'm imposing on the character I am following. I think as a rabbi, and as a theological person or a person interested in religion from within the world of religion, it was always a question for me, the relationship between faith and historiography. There's earlier works about this, The Historian and the Believer by Van Harnack, etc. I am generally tend to believe that from a historiosophical perspective or historiographical perspective, religion was kind of cast aside in the understanding of Zionist history in general at the time. One of my teachers, Ehud Luz, he's like his father was Kaddish Luz, the first head of the Knesset, or the second, I think, maybe head of the Knesset. I think I was trying to, in that sense, to redeem the religious aspects of the earlier story of Zionism and of Reform movement, and of American Zionism and of the Reform movement.
But maybe that happened because they were so marginal. I mean, the Zionist leadership at the time professed itself as very secular, and certainly the Reform movement. I mean, the religious sects within Zionism were cast aside, and the Reform movements was barely existent.
So they were indeed very marginal, and Magnes was, I think, even marginalized within the Reform movement because, especially in the 40s, he's already sidelined by the movement itself because the movement becomes much more associated with the mainstream establishment of Zionism following the 40s and the rise of Hitler and the Biltmore program and kind of the involvement. So he is he's an outstanding figure. He's a sidelined figure. But I think he also represents a voice that echoes throughout American Zionist history, and I think it's to some extent also amplified today. If you look at the kind of voices that hold some of the critique of Zionism that you might have discussed also with Jeff Levine, there's a religious strand there. There's a kind of religious commitment that underlines those kind of thinkers, and I think he is, to some extent, the forefather of that line of thinking.
Yeah, so he was sidelined, he was lonely and all these things, but yet he kept some sort of like a status, this grandeur of, whatever he was in Palestine. He was the founding president of the Hebrew University. It's quite a road to go down in history with. And also down to other crossroads in history. For example, he met with President Harry Truman on the eve of the establishment of the State of Israel. So, the President of the United States, especially at this point, would not accept just anyone. How did it happen? I'm sure it wasn't down to him solely, but the fact that he was conceptually very marginal on the one hand and, publicly rather prominent.
I don't want to get into too much trouble by saying this, but part of the fact that he had so much power also had to do with the fact that he was related to funding that was coming into the Hebrew University and generally funding coming into the Yeshuv from non-Zionist circles, at least up until the 30s. In the 40s, when this kind of, he seems to be less important to that end, both in his influence on the political and on the financial factors there. But if you ask yourself how come Henry Truman agrees to meet Judah Leib Magnes. So Magnes is stranded in New York in March 1948. He's had a heart attack and he can't travel back to Palestine. And he had already established Ichud, which is an organization that promoted binationalism in the 40s, and one of the members of Ichud, of the Friends of Ichud, was Hannah Arendt, that was kind of hosting him at the time in 1948, and they became close friends. I think within the American established, first of all, they were looking for American commentators, in the field. He always maintained this Americanism that could help him explain things to American. And within the American political apparatus at the time, there were two main voices, as were in the British. It's always the professional/foreign office people were not in favor of Zionism, and Magnes was. And on the other hand, Truman was a more accepting kind of voice. When he meets Truman tells him that he has the notes from his 1946 testimony before the Anglo-American Committee in his desk, and that he looks at them once in a while. That might not obviously be true, but that is, something to say. And I think he latches onto something that I also pointed out when I observed the work of the Anglo-American Committee. There's something in Magnes which is like this prophetic figure, prophetic language, perceived as a Jeremiah by his contemporaries, by American onlookers, by American reverends. So I think especially Truman picks up on this vision and echoes this vision. It's a tragic vision because he does not like Jeremiah. His prophecy is not accepted neither by Ben-Gurion nor by Truman. But there is respect for his kind of moral voice. So essentially they invite him in order so that they can feel vindicated in their moral considerations. But eventually it's the real politics that decides the case.
Yeah. So looking at him and his life work in this way, you cannot escape the thought that everything that he did, that his failure was at the end of the day a foregone conclusion. Would you agree?
I think politically it was a foregone conclusion. I think from theologically, also to some extent within his own perception, up until really the last kind of days, which is his last days, he perceived continuing to strive to realize his essentially messianic vision of politics and reality. He calls this the crowning glory of my life. I think from a religious perspective, your life's work is not only measured by the political actual success of what you had achieved, but maybe also by the longevity of your ideas and your commitment to that idea. So I think from that he kind of held to that kind of self-perception, and he writes this in a few correspondences as well. I think it's actually at the very end, after the assassination of Bernadotte, which is the Swedish UN figure who is trying to negotiate a situation in Palestine in 1948, after the assassination,
and he's assassinated by a Zionist
militant I think it's October 1948. That's really a breaking point for him that I think maybe might have even hastened his death.
Yeah. So would you say that in the grand scheme of things, he was more influential as a theologian than as a politician or maybe a public figure?
I think that's a good question. To be totally honest, I think he might not have been very influential on both kind of aspects. His theology is not very. I think many people have missed the theological aspects in his work, and they didn't carry through the 50s and 60s. If you look at what influenced American Jewish thinking at the time, there's Kaplan and the more pragmatic side, and then you have, let's say, Heschel and that kind of thinking, which is as prevailed much more. There is a return to Magnes in certain circles, and there's a very famous blog called the Magnes Zionist, which kind of, addresses those issues. I think he was, to some extent, doomed to fail, both in terms of promoting his theological vision and in terms of his political vision. But again, I think that from a theological point of view, time will tell. There's a story about him. One of his acquaintances, I think it's Stern, meets him in 1947, and Magnes tells him something like that there will be a war for 200 years. That was kind of his, let's say, prophecy at the time. So that still has to be proven or disproven. So
We're getting there.
yeah,
Yeah.
but So I'll leave you to let's get there. But I'll share more in a minute.
Yeah. No. So, what really is his legacy for today's reform community? You said that he was receding from he wasn't a classic reform rabbi already in his lifetime, but his theological worldview and his political worldview. What really is their legacy for today's reform movement in Israel and in America?
So I think his legacy has to do with maintaining a commitment to Israel and Zionism vis-a-vis the moral challenges that are presented through its evolvement and through the history of the State of Israel, and especially in the tragic circumstances that we are experiencing since October 7 and the Hamas attack, of course, and the war after that. I think from Magnes's perspective, or if you look at the acceptance of his work and the way it's kind of influenced other people in the reform movement, both in the US and in Israel, it's the idea that you maintain the moral commitment, you keep on posting moral challenges and questions, but you remain committed. Magnes never went back. He did go back to the US, but he didn't kind of decide that he was going back to America. It's a tragedy to some extent that many of his siblings did not remain in Israel. Some did and some did not. So from my point of view, from my understanding, commitment vis-a-vis moral questioning, my critique, I would say to some extent contemporary critique that has to do also maybe with things I have undergone in my own intellectual kind of thinking. Sometimes that kind of moral expectation is projected as kind of idealism and does not address enough the real Israel, he never really understood some of the real Israel. There's just one story around that. He meets Sakakini, a very famous Palestinian thinker and poet at the time. He meets him at the Shepherd Hotel in 1942. And Sakakini, he tells Sakakini, why don't you join us in our kind of binationalist effort? I'm thinking maybe because as a Christian you might be critical of it might be the Muslim thinking that's influencing you. So he has a kind of question then. Then Sakakini tells him a story about a donkey rider. So a donkey rider is driving down the road and then he sees a hitchhiker. So the hitchhiker hops on the donkey and then the hitchhiker says, "How fast is your donkey?" And then they continue and that's great. And then he says, after a few minutes, he says, "How fast is our donkey?" And the donkey rider says, "Well, maybe you should get off." And then he says, "Why?" Because he says, "I'm afraid next thing you'll say is how fast is my donkey." So the entire idealistic, moralistic view of binationalism as this perfectly moral solution that squares the circle of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was oblivious to the fact that from a very realistic Palestinian perspective, they had claim to the land and we did not. And we were just taking over, essentially, the land of Palestine. And he could not come to terms with that or offer something that would be able to fully address that.
I'm hearing that this critique is mainly aimed at American reforms rather than local ones, Israeli ones.
So the Israeli reform movement has always been a bit more conservative than an American reform movement. First of all, even if you look at the early Siddur of the reform movement in Israel in 1981, Avodah Shebelev, they never removed the Zionist aspects, let's say, out of the Siddur. There's a very strong kind of Israelization and Zionism trend in the 80s in the reform movement in Israel. I think this is a critique that's mostly pointed towards the American reform movement. I'll say also, again, as having been ordained by the reform movement in Israel, although I'm at the moment not associated with the movement, the reform movement also failed to support enough the reform movement in Israel and the Zionist essentially process in Israel in the 60s and in the 70s and in the 80s. Some has been written about this, and I've written about this as well. From an American perspective, essentially, the particular aspect of Zionism vis-a-vis the universalist vision of Reform Judaism and the universalist requirements for integration within America, the greater American society, is kind of a conflict that's very difficult to overcome.
All right, Dr. David Barak Gorodetsky of the University of Haifa, the author of the rather newly published Judah Magnes, The Prophetic Politics of a Religious Binationalist. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you very much, Gilad.
And many thanks to Itai Shalom, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto a Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close to 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.